You're lying in bed and you hear it, a faint creak overhead, a shift of weight where no one should be. Your attic, your crawl space. The places in your home you never check. The spaces just above and below where the darkness has been waiting, watching. Tonight we're not flinching at shadows outside your window. We're looking up and we're looking down. These are 10 true accounts of stalkers who lived in the hidden places, the attics, the crawl spaces, the gaps between walls, breathing the same air, walking the same floorboards, closer than you ever imagined. Welcome to 10 True Stalkers in the Attic, Crawlspace Horror Stories. When my wife and I bought the old Craftsman on Sycamore Street, the one thing the previous owner mentioned almost as a joke was that the attic was full of history. But he didn't explain why the access door in the upstairs hallway had a heavy deadbolt on our side, a lock that looked brand new against the aged wooden frame. And when I asked him about it, he just shrugged and said, "Better safe than sorry, kid." We moved in during a blistering August. And for the first 2 months, the attic was just an attic. A dark, dusty space above our bedroom, where the insulation lay in uneven clumps, and the previous owner had left behind a few cardboard boxes of old records and yellowed newspapers, the air up there stifling and completely still. Then autumn arrived, and with it, the noises. It started as a soft, rhythmic tapping above our bed, like someone drumming their fingers against the floorboards, always at exactly 2:47 a.m. My wife slept through it, but I would lie rigid, eyes open in the dark, listening to that patient, deliberate pattern, tap, 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 pause, tap, 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 and telling myself it was just the house settling, just old wood contracting in the cold, just my imagination. But the tapping began to move. It crossed from above our bed to above the hallway, then above the spare bedroom, and back again, always at the same hour. And I realized with a creeping, sickening certainty that the pattern was a person walking on their hands and knees, carefully placing their weight so as not to make the floorboards groan, except for that one spot above our headboard where the old wood was loose and betrayed a soft thump with every pass. I told my wife, and she said I was working too hard, that we should call an exterminator for raccoons, but I knew the difference between animal and human movement. And the thing in the attic was human. It had a rhythm, a patience, a malevolent intelligence that no animal possesses. I didn't call an exterminator. I called a locksmith, and I had a second deadbolt installed on the attic door. I had a heavy steel one that required a key from our side. And that night, for the first time in weeks, I slept through until morning. But when I woke, the key that I had left on my nightstand was missing, and the attic door at the end of the hall was ever so slightly ajar. A thin line of blackness visible between the door and the frame, when from within that blackness came a smell that was unmistakably human. Stale sweat, unwashed skin, the faint iron temps of old blood, and I knew then that whoever was in the attic had come down while we slept, had stood in our bedroom doorway, had watched our breathing, had taken the key, and had then returned to the darkness above us, locking themselves in from our side. The police found a nest in the attic, carefully constructed hollow pressed into the fiberglass insulation directly above our bed, surrounded by empty soup cans, plastic water bottles, and dozens of photographs of us sleeping, eating, undressing, watching television, all taken from the sliver of space between the attic floorboards. And tucked into the nest was a driver's license belonging to a man named Harold Kinney, the previous owner, who had never moved out, who had simply retreated into the attic, who had lived there for 6 years, who had been watching us every single night, his breath held, his hand pressed flat against the floor, just inches above our sleeping faces. My friends and I rented a remote cabin in the Adirondacks for a long winter weekend. Beautiful A-frame with a stone fireplace and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over a frozen lake. And the only thing off about the place was the smell. A faint, swampy odor of damp earth and decay that seemed to rise through the floorboards every time the furnace kicked on. A smell that the rental agency dismissed as just the crawl space. It's an old cabin, nothing to worry about. We didn't worry. We drank wine by the fire, we played board games, we laughed about the idea of ghosts in the woods, and at night we retreated to our separate bedrooms. Me to the loft, my 3 friends to the 2 rooms on the main floor, all of us exhausted from the cold and the altitude. I was the one who heard it first, because I was the one directly above the main living area. And what I heard filtering up through the heating vent near my bed was a conversation. Not our conversation. A low, muttering monologue spoken in a voice that was hoarse and wet. The voice of someone who had been alone so long that they talked to themselves just to hear a human sound. I crept down the loft stairs, expecting to find one of my friends on a late-night phone call. But the living room was empty, the fire down 2 embers, and the voice was coming from the floor. I knelt and pressed my ear to the cold hardwood, and I could make out words now. Broken and obsessive. Been here longer than them. Seen her in the blue sweater. It's the one with the red hair. She's mine. I'll wait until they're all asleep. Then I'll come up and just look. Just look. I woke my friends. We stood in a terrified huddle in the kitchen, and we listened as the voice continued its monologue, detailing our appearances, our conversations, our sleeping arrangements, and then with a sudden, sharp clarity saying, "They hear me. They're awake." That's fine. I can wait. We called the police, but the nearest station was an hour away. And the deputy who finally arrived at dawn had a face that was too grim to knowing, and he told us before he even checked the crawl space, the cabin had a history. 3 years earlier, a man named Gerald Dobbs had gone missing in these woods. He'd been a drifter, a man who squatted in empty vacation homes, and when the first responders searched the cabin, they'd found evidence that he'd been living in the crawl space. A sleeping bag, canned food, a hunting knife, but they'd never found Dobbs himself. The deputy pried open the crawlspace access door in the back of the pantry, and we all shined our flashlights into that low, dark space, and what we saw was not a decaying sleeping bag or old cans, but a fresh, meticulously arranged living space. With a new sleeping bag, a battery-powered lantern, and a pair of my red-haired friend's hair ties neatly coiled on a folded pair of jeans that had been stolen from her suitcase. And in the center of the sleeping bag, written in what looked like charcoal, were the words, "They came back. The one with the red hair is mine. I just want to watch. I will always watch." Dobbs had never left. He had been living under that cabin for years, moving between the crawl space and the deep woods. Waiting for renters, waiting for us, and as we stood there in the frozen dawn, we heard him not from the crawl space anymore, but from outside, from the tree line, a hoarse, wet voice calling softly, "I'll be here when you come back. I'll always be here." My childhood bedroom had a large metal air vent set high on the wall, a relic of an old heating system that connected directly to the attic. And for as long as I could remember, I would hear faint sounds coming through that vent at night, not the whoosh of air. But something softer, something organic, sound like someone breathing through a thin cloth, and my parents always told me it was just the house settling, just the wind. Just my active imagination. But I was a child who paid attention, and I noticed things that adults dismissed. I noticed that the vent cover was loose, that it had been pried away from the wall at some point and never properly reattached. I noticed that sometimes when I woke in the morning, there were faint, chalky fingerprints on the white paint around the vent's edges, fingerprints that were too large to be mine. And I noticed that on the nights when the breathing was loudest, I would dream of a face, a thin, pale, sexless face with dark holes where the eyes should be pressed against the vent grate, staring down at me with a patience that was not human. I told my parents again and again, and they humored me by inspecting the attic with flashlights, but they never found anything, never saw anything. And after a while they stopped checking, and I learned to sleep with my back to the vent, a pillow pressed over my head. When I was 14, I finally grew brave enough to investigate myself. I waited until my parents were out of the house, and I climbed the pull-down ladder into the attic, a flashlight in one hand and a kitchen knife in the other, and I crawled through the dusty, fiberglass-strewn darkness toward the space directly above my bedroom, toward the place where the old vent shaft dropped down into the wall. What I found there stopped my breath in my throat. Someone had built a little room in that corner of the attic, a space screened off with old blankets and cardboard, and in that room there was a mattress, a bucket, a pile of empty food wrappers, and a collection of objects that I recognized. A stuffed bear I had lost when I was 7, a hairbrush I had thrown away, a school photo of me from 2nd grade, dozens and dozens of photographs taken from above my bed, all of me sleeping, all of me unaware. All of me watched. On the mattress, there was a single folded piece of paper, and on it, in cramped, obsessive handwriting, was a letter addressed to me by name. I've been watching you since you were 2 years old. I come down when you're asleep and I stand by your bed and I listen to you breathe. I know your dreams. I know your fears. I am your real parent. People downstairs are just pretenders. One day when you're old enough, I'll come down the stairs and I'll take you home. Wait for me. Love, your watcher. I screamed and scrambled backward, and as I did, my flashlight beam swept across the far corner of the attic. And for one blinding, terrible second I saw him, a man, thin and pale, crouched in the shadows. His face, exactly the face from my dreams, his mouth open in a silent, adoring smile, and then he was gone. Vanished into the deeper darkness of the attic, leaving behind only the soft sound of breathing through a thin cloth, a sound that I still hear every night. 30 years later, from the air vent in my own child's bedroom. I lived alone in a renovated warehouse loft, a gorgeous open-plan space with exposed brick walls and massive factory windows. And the only thing I didn't love was the floor, a raised wooden platform that had been built over the original concrete, creating a hollow space about 18 inches deep beneath my feet. A space that I never thought about until the night I heard something breathing down there. It started with a soft, nearly subsonic thrum that vibrated up through the floorboards into my bed frame, a vibration that felt like a heartbeat, and when I pressed my ear to the wood, I could hear it clearly. The steady, rhythmic inhale and exhale of a living creature. So close that I could hear the slight wet catch in its throat, the way it held its breath for a long moment before exhaling. The way it shifted its weight and caused the floorboards to creak ever so slightly, directly beneath where I slept. I told my landlord, and he sent a handyman who pulled up a section of the floor in the corner of the living room. And we both stared down into the darkness below, the flashlight illuminating a space that was supposed to be empty, a cavity of concrete and support beams. but was instead filled with things: blankets, a pillow, a battery-powered alarm clock, a stack of paperback books with their spines cracked, and a Tupperware container full of what looked like human hair. The handyman, a wiry old man named Carl who had seen a lot of strange things in old buildings, turned to me and said, "Someone's been living under your floor, kid. And they've been living here a while." He crawled down into the space, and I stood above, watching his flashlight beam move deeper under the floor, illuminating more and more evidence of habitation. A hot plate, a 5-gallon water jug, a pair of my own missing sneakers, and then the beam stopped. And Carl's voice came up through the floorboards, tight and strained. "There's a hole down here, a hole in the concrete. It goes down into the basement." My building didn't have a basement. It was built on a slab according to every record I'd checked, and yet there was a hole, a jagged, man-made opening in the concrete, and from that hole, Carl said, came a draft of cold, stale air and a smell that he described only as wrong. He climbed out faster than I'd ever seen a man his age move, and he told me, pale and sweating, that he wasn't coming back, that I needed to call the police, that whoever had been living under my floor had come from somewhere else, somewhere beneath the building, somewhere that wasn't on any blueprint. The police came, and they pulled up more floorboards, and they discovered a network of tunnels, crude, hand-dug tunnels that connected the space beneath my loft to the crawl spaces of 3 other units in the building, and in one of those tunnels, they found the man. He was alive, naked, covered in dirt, and he had been living in the spaces between our floors for at least 2 years, merging at night through hidden hatches to walk among us, to steal our food, to watch us sleep, to whisper to us through the vents, and when they asked him why, he just smiled and said, in a voice that was eerily calm, "You all make such beautiful music when you don't know you're being watched." I just wanted to listen. I moved out the next week, but I still think about the floor beneath my feet, every floor and every room I enter, and I wonder how many of us are walking above someone right now. I installed a security camera in my bedroom after a string of minor, unsettling incidents. Objects moved from the dresser, closet doors left open, the faint smell of stale tobacco in a home where no one smoked, and I positioned the camera to face my bed, hoping to catch the sleepwalking episode I assumed I was having. But what the camera caught instead changed everything I thought I knew about my own house. The first few nights of footage were unremarkable. Me, sleeping, restless, the room still and dark, the occasional shift of shadows from passing headlights outside the window. But on the 4th night, at exactly 3:15 a.m., the attic hatch in the ceiling of my hallway, a small square panel just outside the bedroom door, slowly, silently, began to lower. It didn't slam, it didn't creak. It just descended with a terrifying, careful precision, as if someone had practiced this motion 100 times, and then a pair of bare feet, pale and filthy, came through the opening, followed by legs, a torso, a head, the head of a man I had never seen before, with matted hair and sunken eyes, and a smile that was too wide to knowing. He dropped to the hallway floor with the lightness of a cat, and he stood there for a long moment just outside my bedroom door. His head tilted, as if listening to my breathing, and then he stepped into my room. The camera's night vision captured him with awful clarity, a gaunt, middle-aged man in tattered, dirty clothing. His movements slow and deliberate, his eyes fixed on my sleeping form. He stood at the foot of my bed for 23 minutes, not moving, not blinking, just watching me with that terrible, adoring smile. Then he turned, walked to my dresser, opened my jewelry box, and removed a single piece, a locket containing a photo of my late mother, which he held to his lips, kissed, and placed gently back, and then he left. He climbed back up into the attic, pulled the hatch closed behind him, and was gone. I watched the footage at 7 a.m., my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. I called the police, who arrived within 10 minutes, who climbed into the attic with guns drawn, and who found a fully furnished living space directly above my bedroom. A cot, a camp stove, a battery-powered lamp, and a wall covered in hundreds of photographs of me sleeping, reading, crying, laughing, dating back more than a year. The man was gone by the time they searched, but they found his diary, and in it, he had written over and over, "She is my daughter. She doesn't know me yet, but she will. Come to her every night at 3:15, and I watch her sleep, and I keep her safe. And one day I will wake her, and she will come home with me." The man was never caught. And I have since learned that he had been living in the attics of 3 different houses before mine, always choosing a single occupant. Always watching, always waiting, always leaving behind a diary that began with the same words. "She is my family. I have not slept without a light on in 4 years, and I don't think I ever will again." I was a graduate student living in the cheapest apartment I could find. A basement unit in a century-old building that had once been a tuberculosis sanatorium. And the apartment had a peculiar feature, a locked door in the back of the closet that led, according to the superintendent, to a sealed sub-crawl space that was structurally unsound and completely empty. The door was secured with a heavy padlock, and I never gave it a second thought until the night I came home late from the lab and found the padlock lying on the floor, the door slightly ajar, and a cold draft seeping through the crack that smelled of wet concrete and something else, something organic and sweet, like old flowers left to rot in a vase. I assumed the super had been down there for maintenance, so I pushed the door closed, reattached the lock, and went to bed. But at around 2 a.m., I was woken by a sound that was unmistakably a hand, a human hand, sliding down the inside of the closet door. The fingernails scratching slow, deliberate lines into the wood from the other side. I froze, my heart slamming, and I listened as the scratching stopped and a voice, low and cracked, began to whisper through the door. "Let me in. I know you're there. I've been listening to you for months. I hear your phone calls. I hear your dreams. Let me in." I didn't let him in. I shoved my dresser against the closet door and called 911. And when the officers arrived and forced open the sub-crawlspace door, they found a tunnel. It was a crude, hand-dug passage that led from my closet into a larger chamber, a disused boiler room from the sanatorium days that wasn't on any current blueprints, and in that chamber, they found a man. He was elderly, emaciated, wearing a stained hospital gown, and he had been living in that sealed-off room for what he claimed was since the cure. His name was Albert Mears, and he had been a patient at the sanatorium in 1954. When the building had been converted, when the sub-basement had been sealed and forgotten, and he had been down there ever since, surviving on rainwater that seeped through cracks and rats that he caught with his bare hands. And he had spent the last 60 years listening to the tenants above him, pressing his ear to the pipes, learning their names, their habits, their secrets, knew things about me that no one else knew. My mother's maiden name, the name of my childhood dog, the nightmare I had every year on the anniversary of my father's death, and he had written it all down on the walls of his chamber. A sprawling, obsessive record of 60 years of stolen intimacies. When the police tried to remove him, he fought them with a strength that a man of his size should not have possessed, and he screamed over and over, "I'm not leaving. I belong here. They belong to me. All of them belong to me." They finally sedated him and took him away, and the sub-crawl space was filled with concrete. But I moved out that week, and I still have nightmares about that voice, that low, cracked whisper, and the realization that he had been under my bed for my entire life, breathing my air, listening to my secrets, waiting for the day I finally opened the door. I took a house-sitting job for a wealthy family who were spending the summer in Europe, sprawling mid-century modern home tucked into the hills above Los Angeles. My only responsibilities were to water the plants, collect the mail, and feed the cat, a sleek, an unfriendly creature named Sphinx, who spent most of her time staring at a particular spot on the living room wall, a blank section of drywall next to the fireplace, and yowling, a low, mournful sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The house was beautiful, all glass and open spaces. But there was something deeply unsettling about it at night. A sense of being watched that I couldn't shake. A persistent, creeping certainty that I was not alone. That there were eyes on me from some unseen vantage point. I chalked it up to nerves and the unfamiliarity of the space. But on the third night, I found the crawlspace door. It was hidden behind a large abstract painting in the hallway, a small, unremarkable door painted the same color as the wall, with a simple brass knob that turned easily in my hand. I should not have opened it, but I did, and my flashlight revealed a low, dusty space beneath the house, crisscrossed with pipes and ducts, and scattered across the floor. Dozens and dozens of photographs of the family who lived above the mother. The father, the two young daughters, taken at angles that could only have been achieved from inside the house, from inside the walls, from inside the crawl space itself. I felt my blood turn to ice as I realized that the photographs were not old. They were recent, some of them dated just weeks before the family left for Europe, and on the back of each one, in a cramped, spidery handwriting, were notes. Mother wakes at 6:14. Likes the blue robe. Youngest daughter cries in her sleep. I comfort her through the wall. Father drinks whiskey in the study at 11 p.m. Drink with him in the dark. The notes were obsessively detailed, chronicling years of intimate observation. And as I crouched there in that dusty space, reading through this library of stolen lives, I heard a sound behind me, a soft, shuffling movement, the whisper of bare feet on concrete, and I spun around. My flashlight beam catching a shape that was already retreating into the deeper darkness of the crawl space, shape that was human but somehow wrong, too thin, too silent, moving with a spider-like fluidity that made my stomach heave. I scrambled out of the crawl space, slammed the door, and called the family in Europe, my voice shaking so badly I could barely form words. And the mother listened quietly and then said, in a tone that was terrifyingly calm, "We know. We've always known. We tried to catch him, tried to block the access points. But he always finds a way back in. We've learned to live with him. We don't talk about it. We just pretend he's not there." I left the house that night and never returned. And to this day, I cannot think about that family without wondering if they are still pretending, still living their beautiful glass-walled lives, while beneath their feet, a man they have never seen watches their every move and writes their secrets on the back of stolen photographs. After my divorce, I bought a fixer-upper on the edge of town, a tired little bungalow that needed work but had good bones. And the first major project I tackled was the attic, ripping out the old, moldy insulation and replacing it with new, energy-efficient batting, a job that was hot, filthy, and utterly miserable. I was about halfway through the job, pulling out chunks of yellowed fiberglass, when my gloved hand hit something solid, a small leather-bound journal wedged between two rafters, its cover cracked and stained with age. I took it downstairs, cleaned the dust off it, and opened it. And what I found inside made me put the house on the market 3 days later. The journal belonged to a man named Samuel Cross, and it was a meticulous day-by-day account of his life, not a memoir. Not a diary, but a log of observation, written entirely about the previous owner of the house, a single mother named Elaine, who had lived there with her young son from 1998 to 2014. Samuel Cross had been living in the attic that entire time. He had entered through a loose vent in the eaves, and he had built a small platform in the space directly above Elaine's bedroom, and from that platform he had watched her sleep every night for 16 years. The journal was horrifyingly detailed. It recorded the time she went to bed and woke up, the names of the men she dated, the arguments she had on the phone, the moments she cried alone in her kitchen, the lullabies she sang to her son, the color of her sheets, the brand of her shampoo, the sound of her breathing when she had a cold. But the most disturbing part was not the observation, it was the escalation. As the years passed, Samuel's entries grew more possessive, more delusional, more violent. He began referring to Elaine as his wife. He began describing fantasies of coming down the stairs and making her see me. He wrote about sneaking into her bedroom while she was at work and lying in her bed, pressing his face into her pillow, wearing her clothes. And then, in the final entries, the tone shifted. The last 10 pages were filled with a single sentence written over and over in handwriting that grew increasingly jagged and frantic. Tonight. Tonight. After that, the journal went blank. I did my research. I looked up Elaine, and I found her. She was alive, living 2 states away, and when I reached out to her and told her what I had found, she was silent for a long moment before she said, in a voice that was thin and haunted, "I always knew there was something in the attic. I could hear him at night, breathing, moving, but no one believed me. The police checked, and they never found anyone, but I knew. One night I woke up, and he was standing at the foot of my bed. He just stood there, staring. And then he turned and walked away, back into the attic, and I never saw him again. But I never forgot. Samuel Cross was never caught. His body was never found. But his journal sits in a police evidence locker now, and I have not spent a single night in a house with an attic since." When my daughter started talking about the nice lady in the ceiling, my wife and I assumed it was an imaginary friend, the usual childhood invention. But then our son, barely 3, began waking up with nightmares about the woman with the long fingers who came out of the wall and stood by his crib. And we started to wonder if something else was going on. Our house was a Victorian with a complex network of crawl spaces and attics. We had always known that some of those spaces were inaccessible, sealed off during renovations. Decades ago, but we had never considered that someone might be living inside them. Then the gifts started appearing, small things. A smooth pebble on my daughter's windowsill, a wilted flower on my son's dresser, a ribbon tied in a bow around the leg of my wife's nightstand. And then the notes, scraps of paper, written in a looping, old-fashioned cursive, left in places only we would find them. "You are such a good mother." I wish I had been a good mother. I was not a good mother. I lost my boy. I will not lose yours. The notes grew more frequent, more disturbing, and my wife, terrified, called a contractor who specialized in old houses, who crawled into the sealed crawl space above the nursery and found a woman. She was in her 60s, emaciated, wearing a dress that had once been white and was now gray with dust. And she had been living in that sealed space for what she later told the police was, since before the children were born, since before the house was sold. Since my own boy died, her name was Margaret, and she had been the previous owner of the house, the woman who had sold it to us 7 years earlier, and she had never actually left. She had sealed herself into the crawl space the day before the closing, and she had been living there ever since, surviving on insects and rainwater and the food she occasionally stole from our pantry when we were asleep, emerging through a hidden panel in the nursery closet to watch our children, to touch their faces while they slept, to whisper her long-dead son's name into the darkness. She was not violent. She was not angry. She was, in her own shattered way, loving. She had come to believe that our children were her children reincarnated, and that she was their true mother. And she had spent 7 years watching over them from the spaces between the walls, a ghost made of flesh and grief and obsession. When the police took her away, she didn't fight, and reached for the nursery door and said, "Please let me say goodbye to my babies. Please. I've never missed a single night." We moved out the following month. We could not bear the thought of those empty, sealed spaces above our heads, and we could not unhear the sound of her voice, that desperate, loving, broken voice whispering through the walls, "Mommy's here. Mommy's always here." I rented a small ground-floor apartment in a converted Victorian. My landlord, a quiet, polite man named Mr. Albrecht, who lived in the unit above me, was always the perfect landlord. He fixed things promptly. He never raised the rent. He never complained about noise. The only odd thing about him was the way he always seemed to know when I was home. Even when I hadn't seen him, even when I'd been quiet, even when I'd come in late and gone straight to bed. He would text me in the morning with things like, "Hope you slept well. I heard you come in around 2 inches or you were coughing last night. Would you like some tea?" And I wrote it off as thin walls and an attentive landlord until the night I discovered the door in my bedroom closet floor. I had lived in the apartment for 8 months by then, and I had never noticed it before. A small, square trapdoor hidden beneath a loose section of carpet, its edges so perfectly flush with the floor that it was nearly invisible. And when I pried it open, I found a ladder descending into a narrow crawl space that ran directly beneath my bedroom. It was not empty. It was furnished. A thin mattress, a battery-powered lamp, a stack of books, a cooler, and a laptop that was open, still running, its screen facing up toward my floor. The laptop's camera was pointed through a tiny hole in the floorboards, a hole I had never seen from above, directly at my bed. I felt the world tilt. I climbed down into that space, my heart hammering so hard I could barely breathe. And I looked at the laptop screen. It was running a video feed of my bedroom, my bed, my body, live. And it had been recording for months, storing terabytes of footage on an external hard drive that was labeled, in Mr. Albrecht's neat handwriting, Tenant 4. Sarah, I was Tenant 4. There had been 3 before me. I went through the files, shaking, and I found footage of women I didn't know. Asleep in my bed, unaware, watched, recorded from every angle through holes in the walls and ceilings and floor. Dawn, And I realized with a sick, plunging horror that Mr. Albrecht had built the crawl space specifically for this purpose. That he had been living beneath me the entire time I had been renting, that he probably spent every night down there. Inches below my body, watching me sleep, listening to me breathe, touching himself in the dark. I called the police from inside the crawl space, my voice barely a whisper. And when they arrived and arrested Mr. Albrecht, they found a key ring in his pocket with keys to every unit in the building and a notebook in his apartment with detailed notes on every tenant he had ever watched, including me. Sarah sleeps on her left side, talks in her sleep sometimes, likes to read before bed. She's my favorite. I think I might keep her. I broke my lease that night and moved 3 states away. But I still check every closet floor, every closet, every rug, looking for the seam of a hidden door, because I know now that landlords like Mr. Albrecht are not as rare as we want to believe, and the space beneath your feet is never as empty as you think it is. And that's 10 reasons to check your attic tonight. If any of these stories made you glance up at that hatch in your hallway, or listen a little closer to the floorboards beneath your feet, then I've done my job. The real horror isn't in some far-off haunted house, it's in the spaces we ignore. The hidden rooms we never think to enter, the darkness just above the ceiling and just below the floor. Thank you for spending the night with me. Subscribe for more stories that creep closer and closer to home. I'll see you in the next one if you dare to look.